Good day. This is the second video about advertising. The first video I have done the introduction of the whole advertising scenario. So I'm going to give an introduction, brief introduction of how and what and the advertising, what advertising means and how it affects, so on and so forth. So, in this sense, advertising, as I mentioned in the first video, advertising is a kind of a communication a seller is making towards the buyer. One might ask, why do you need advertising? Because buyers are having needs and wants. If the sellers are making products, is there anything like advertising? What kind of a concept is this? Is it needed? It is needed in this particular sense. We'll try to define what sales is in the first place, and we'll see how advertising is going to get fitted in. Sales, when you define what a sale is, there are two things. First one is the transfer of ownership or transfer of title from a seller to buyer. The second point is that has to happen on a monetary consideration, which means money or the amount, a rupee or dollar or a pound amount should get involved and should get agreed upon. Whereas a sale means it has to happen with two aspects. A seller is transferring the ownership to the buyer on a monetary consideration. So from the buyer's point of view, why should you take the ownership on a monetary? I mean, anybody would like to take any ownership or title free of charge, right? So there's a that's a gift is like that. When you are going to give a gift to somebody, you are transferring the ownership to another one, whereas the monetary value or monetary consideration is not going to get affected or not going to be talked about. Whereas a sale, you transfer the ownership, or rather the seller is transferring the ownership to the buyer on a monetary consideration. So in that sense, there is a decision to be made by the buyer. Nobody can force him, nobody can overly influence him, because it's about his money, it's about his uh, earnings that has to be spent to get the ownership of a product or a service. So in that sense, we call it a rational decision, whereas it may be a rational decision, it may not be a rational decision, whereas the customer has to decide to take on the ownership of a particular product, and he has to get agreed to a sum which is the seller is suggesting. There may be negotiations, that's a different story, but anyhow, there will be a monetary consideration. So in that sense, at the time of transferring the ownership, it is somewhat hard for a seller to convince the buyer to make a decision with a monetary consideration. So advertising will ease this job. Advertising will help the seller to do this job easily, which means the advertising process is a convincing process, a mind changing process, or a perception changing process, or maybe a paradigm shift of a customer. Whereas if you do proper advertising, the customer will have a changed mind to or convinced mind to buy your product. So it is easier for any seller to do advertising and then make the customer convinced and then do the sale. So we call it is a pre-sale activity. It's a pre-sale activity basically. So it is coming with promotions as well. So advertising is a communication where a seller is trying to convince the customer to make a decision on a monetary consideration. That is the basic idea of advertising. On the other hand, advertising is once again comes under it's a mode of communication, right? It's a kind of part of communication. So therefore advertising will be aligned with the principles of communication. So on communication there are two parties, the sender of the communication and the receiver. So here the supplier or the producer and the customer. The message, in a communication there should be a message. The message is the advertisement, where the producer is giving an advertisement for customer to see beforehand before making a decision of buying something, right? So in that sense, the next few theories of communication will get aligned with the advertising as well. Obviously, in a good communication, there should be a clear message, or rather very clear message to be conveyed. In an advertising, you can't just clutter everything. You have to design your message. You have to design your message in a very, very appealing manner, in a short and non-confusing manner to the customer, right? And obviously, advertising will come to the advertising platforms and media and other things. If your message is too long, of course you have to bear a bigger cost. That is also there. But finally, this is a voluntary reception from the customer's point of view. I mean, if there's an advertisement, you can't ask somebody to look at this or watch this or to go through this. That is not the case. It should be a voluntary act from the customer's point of view. The customer should voluntarily look at your advertisement. So however big, however beautiful your advertisement is, will go in vain if the customer is not interested in that advertisement. So therefore, advertising is a kind of a critical thing where you are going to attract and retain the customer for the advertisement with the view of the customer is going to get convinced to buy your product. I have seen some advertisements. Advertisement is extremely good and extremely appealing, but the message is not being properly delivered to the customer that this particular product should be bought, right? So that is also there. Whatever the advertising that you make, some of the advertisements we may remember for maybe years, maybe decades, yet we may have not made any call on a supplier to buy that particular product. So what we have to understand is that the advertisement has to be a very convincing communication, whereas whereas the customer will retain the message, and the customer should get convinced to buy the product, and actually the sale has to be made. So all these things you have to think of. As I said, you can create a world or rather award-winning advertisement. If the sale is not going to happen, it's in vain. There's absolutely no point, right? So therefore, the advertising is, as I said, it's a communication. The communication is with a purpose. It's not just delivering a message. You shouldn't get confused. Your advertisement is being viewed, is being received by thousands and thousands of customers. Now, I will come back to this once again when we are talking about the platforms. I will just give you a kind of a hint, whereas we have seen some YouTube videos having hits or trending videos, which means a lot of customers have seen these videos. Customers have seen this advertisement, but have they done the purchasing? Have they done the have they made the decision to buy this particular product? In simple terms, is the sale being made? Your advertisement may have reached the whole world, but you have to have a sizable customers coming in to buy your products. So advertising means not only the popularity, not only the message conveying, it should be convincing, it should be a temptation for the customer to buy your product. That temptation has to get created through your advertising. That is what is needed. So we are going to talk about the rest of the things in the videos to come. So we are going to wind up today about the introduction of advertising, and we'll go on with all the other topics. Thank you very much.